Welcome to Conservation Conversations, the podcast where we discuss emerging technologies, global trends, and the future of biodiversity conservation with some of the world's leading experts. I'm your host, Sean O'Brien, President and CEO of NatureServe, where we've been working for 50 years to protect endangered species and ecosystems. With this podcast, we want to introduce our audience to some of today's key players in conservation and share the amazing work being done around the globe to protect our planet's rich biodiversity. So on today's show, we have Michelle Nijhuis, who's the author of the new book, Beloved Beasts, Fighting for Life in an Age of Extinction, which is a great title and very sort of horribly near and dear to the heart of those of us here at NatureServe. Michelle is a project editor for The Atlantic and a longtime contributing editor to the High Country News. Her reporting has appeared in publications including National Geographic and the New York Times Magazine, and she received the Kavli Science Journalism Award from the American Association for the Advancement of Science for her piece titled Crisis in the Caves, which was about white nose syndrome in bats, which isn't something that we're going to dig into today, but is something that the Natural Heritage Network talks about a lot because the impact on bats has just been devastating. But anyway, Michelle, thank you for being here. It's great to have you on Conservation Conversations.
Thanks so much for having me, Sean.
Yeah. So a couple of things, I like to ask people how they got started in their career and what inspired them to follow the path that they're on. And you've done an amazing amount of work educating the public. And one of the things you say is that you're a lapsed biologist. But when I read your writing, I think, well, there's not much lapsed there. She's doing the biology still. So I'm sort of curious about that expression, but also what influenced your decision to study biology and then to become more of a science communicator, really?
Well, sometimes I do feel like I'm cheating because I get to go on field expeditions with the same kind of scientists I used to work with, but instead of working alongside them, I get to say, now tell me the story of what you've learned over the last 20 years. and I sometimes feel like I get to hear the story without having to put in the years of dedicated labor. But I do have a undergraduate degree in biology. And then after I graduated from college, I spent a few years working as a field assistant on wildlife research projects around the Southwest. So I was never a proper biologist, but I do have a great affection for biology and biologists and a great curiosity about why and how they do what they do. But I have always also loved writing. And when I graduated from college, I had the idea, which I thought was a kind of crazy idea, that I would combine the two. And at the time, there were not lots of well-known science journalism graduate programs like there are now. There were people writing about science, of course, as there have been for centuries, but there was no clear career path. But fortunately, I went to work at High Country News in Colorado, which covers public lands and resource issues around the American West. And they kindly trained me in journalism, and I was able to start writing about the issues I cared so much about.
It's great. And it's so important. As you know, I talked to Andrea Wolf a couple of months ago about her book on von Humboldt. And so she does science education. And of course, von Humboldt in many ways was one of the earliest science writers as he attempted to pull everything together. So I'm so happy that you're out there doing that for us, because it is so important, and it's one of the biggest challenges. And one of the reasons that we have this podcast is to try and translate the work that we do and into something that's understandable for everybody, so that we can have a greater impact. And speaking of that, you obviously, the title of your book, or the subtitle of the book, talks about extinction. And as you get towards the conclusion of the book, you're talking about the sixth extinction. And I talk about the sixth extinction a lot, but do you have a succinct way of describing the sixth extinction for the listeners?
Well, I can give it a shot. It's the idea that we have had 5 mass extinctions on the planet already, including the one that that killed the dinosaurs. And many scientists believe, especially given the dramatic declines in numbers or abundance of certain species, not necessarily the number of extinctions we're seeing, but the declines in actual numbers of individuals. They're saying we are on the brink, or we are entering a sixth extinction. The difference with this one being that it is primarily caused by human activities. And, I'm curious how you talk about the sixth extinction in your work with your colleagues and with the public, because the thing that it's a very memorable idea. And I have no doubt that it's supported by the data, though it is, I should say, it's a bit of a judgment call. Are we entering the sixth extinction? Or, that is it's not a black and white thing. It's what some scientists think we are. Some scientists think we're a bit further off. Yeah. I have no doubt that the underlying data is correct and is very concerning, but I worry about it as a communication problem, because I think sometimes it comes across as, well, if we're in a mass extinction, then what's the point? This is inevitable. And I have a hard time sometimes talking with people about the fact, well, it could very well, the sixth extinction could very well be already happening. And yet we can still save many species that we care about.
We still need to work to reduce the impact of it in some way. And it is, as you're suggesting, it's a geologic event that is being caused by human activities. This will be visible in the fossil record in the future, which is a terrifying idea. When I talk about the sixth extinction, I talk about it in a lot of the same ways that you're just talking about, how it's, comparable or even potentially larger than things that have happened in the past that were natural, whether it's an asteroid or volcanism or whatever caused it in the past. But that we have an obligation as the cause of this extinction to do something about it. And there's this idea of the rights of species that you talk about in the book. And I say, do we have a moral obligation to prevent species from going extinct? Is it an aesthetic argument that it's the completeness of the ecosystem that we're protecting? Is it the human health argument that we never know, by causing some species to go extinct, how that's going to negatively affect us, or alternatively, where we're going to find a medicine in some species that has gone extinct? And so there's several different, I think, approaches that you can take to making the argument that we have an obligation to try and protect species. Sometimes at NatureServe, we talk about the last of the least and the best of the rest. And it's not unlike what you talk about in the book also, about keeping common things common. And it's not about like, oh, there's only 3 of this species left. Let's see if we can recover it. We've lost so much genetic diversity at that point, and we've lost so much of the work that those species do in the ecosystem at that point that, yes, you're saving them, but are you really saving them? And I think that's one of the things that's interesting about the Natural Heritage Network that we have, is that they absolutely work with species of greatest concern and endangered species, but they often are working with common species as well. And, as we know, many of those common species are managed because they're game species. And that's actually, sort of going back to the book, like, the story of the foundations of conservation and the number of early conservationists who are actually shooting, trapping, and killing enormous numbers of individuals of species, even species that they knew were already endangered, is quite astounding. Sort of the person that you hang the story on, Hockaday, is interesting in that regard.
Oh my gosh.
Hornaday, right?
Hornaday. Yes, William Hornaday was full of, the whole story of conservation, of modern conservation, is full of ironies, but Hornaday personifies most of them. And he was a taxidermist and a trophy hunter who, unlike most of his contemporaries, was really shocked and appalled by the decline of the plains bison, and very, especially unusually, was determined to stop it, was determined to protect the bison. But his very paradoxical reaction was to rush out to Montana and shoot several dozen of the last remaining bison, because in his moral universe, and in the moral universe of the time, he believed that if he was able to build this dramatic diorama of the majestic bison on the plains and put it in the Smithsonian, that millions of people would see it, and they would also be moved to protect the bison. And he may have been, to some extent, correct, that what the display he built was a huge sensation. And I think it cemented the majesty of the bison in many people's minds who otherwise never would have seen anything close to a living bison.
Mm-hmm. It does seem that the display did actually have some effect, especially when you think about the people that he interacted with, who are, threaded throughout the story of the modern conservation movement.
Yeah. And but it is shocking. Even later in the conservation movement, there are plenty of ornithologists who loved birds and loved them so much that they could not resist shooting many more than they should have. And I don't think we have evidence that any single ornithologist actually drove a species extinct, but some of them came dangerously close. Fortunately, we have all kinds of fancy lenses and optics that allow us to see species up close and satisfy that urge. But as I say in the book, the conservation is full of people who did the right things for the wrong reasons and the wrong things for the right reasons.
Mm-hmm. And that you mentioned the moral universe of the time, and then right things for wrong reasons. And just briefly wanted to touch on this topic that's coming up a lot these days as we think about social justice. And that is the names of some of the species, both common names and the scientific names. The one that has actually came up relatively recently when I was on a birding trip was people were talking about the long-tailed duck, which used to be called old squaw. And the name was changed because it was an offensive name. And there are plenty of other examples where inappropriate names are used, or people are referenced in the name of a species. One that there's no issue with this one right now, and I don't think there ever will be, but there's a species out there that's named after one of our former employees.
Oh, you're kidding.
Pine's ground plum. And Milo Pine is a fantastic guy, and he described the species and all of this. But there's plenty of other examples of things named after individuals where we worry about continuing to use that. And I just curious about because you've gone back and you've looked at people in their time and then tried to bring that story forward to today in a much more sort of modern way of looking at things, like with these conservancies in Africa. How do you think about this now, that issue?
Yeah, the naming issue is very interesting to me, because it actually, it may sound like a sort of performative thing, or window dressing. We're just changing things on the surface, but it actually goes quite deep into the power structures within science, because who gets to quote unquote discover a species, who gets to name it, is a long running argument, historical issue in science. And I should be clear, the discussions we're having now are mostly about changing the common names of species, so changing how people communicate about them every day. But there's also, issues with who gets to give a species a scientific name, and who gets to be honored with a species, with the scientific name of a species. And it does remind me very much of the public discussion we're having about monuments and who gets to have a physical monument to them. And there's a columnist for The Guardian who wrote a piece recently about how, well, we should just really move on from this idea of building statues to people, which was a provocation. I don't expect we're going to stop building statues to people, but he was really questioning the whole idea of, like, why do we honor individuals in this way? Is it really a good idea of remembering even perfect people? And there are very few perfect people in the universe. So, it's really, perhaps we should rethink how we are remembering people in general. Perhaps we shouldn't be naming entire species after a single individual and hoping that that later generations don't discover deep flaws in that individual that we didn't know about at the time or didn't recognize at the time. So I think it's a very worthwhile discussion, and again, it has a lot to do with power structures in science, and who's involved in science, who gets to participate in those power structures.
Yeah, it's so great that we're having the conversation. It's too bad we didn't start it sooner. And the whole Linnaean system and who gets to name things is actually, it's both complex sociologically, but it's also very complex just in terms of straight science. And it's one of the big challenges that NatureServe faces all the time.
Oh, I can only imagine. Yeah.
Different states will call the same species different things, even in the scientific name, never mind the common name, and trying to keep it all straight. And the implications for conservation are significant. If one state says 2 or 3 species are actually just one species, that species may not be of concern, but if it's 3 separate species, you might have 3 species that are of concern. Mm-hmm. And so the actual science behind what things are called and how they're grouped is also really important, but it's a totally different issue. It's less about social justice.
Yes.
More about
less about social justice, but full of human decisions, right? I started my book with a chapter about Linnaeus and his personal story, but also the system he developed that we still use for giving species scientific names, because I wanted people to understand that this thing we call species, this unit that is in many ways the currency of conservation, the fundamental unit of conservation, as E.O. Wilson put it, there is a reality to it, but it's also the boundaries of it are constructed by humans. Mm-hmm. And that there's a lot of uncertainty in it. I think sometimes people think, oh, well, the classification for species is a scientific thing. It's cut and dried. You recognize the species, you name it. And as you're saying, there's all kinds of judgment calls that get made in there about what a species is. Is this a different species? Is it a subspecies? And sometimes the decisions people make don't match up and cause a lot of confusion.
Absolutely.
And make a huge difference to conservation.
I really enjoyed the chapter on Linnaeus because you sort of learn about him in Biology 101, but you don't mm-hmm. learn about him, right? You learn about this system, and actually humanizing him a little bit I thought really interesting.
He's a fascinating guy. I mean, Who would take on a project like that? Even hundreds of years ago, when we didn't know there were as many species as there were today, we knew enough to know that it was an overwhelming task. But Linnaeus had the ego and the ambition to take on this challenge of naming every species on Earth.
Well, you also talk in the book about doing a search, I think, in a database on the word biodiversity and biological diversity, and how few references there were or none in 1982 compared to now. Well, imagine having to do that research before there were computers and it was all on paper. And then in Linnaeus's day, you had to go to the place. You couldn't just call somebody or have somebody email you a bunch of records, never mind a database. And so, it's incredibly daunting to imagine that he had the hubris to say that he could do it. But it's great that he got it started for us.
And he didn't like to travel. I mean, I love that, he was a Swedish biologist who he liked to be outside, but he traveled some in his youth, but he basically liked to stay at home. And so later in life, he sent out his adventurous students, to what we called the New World then, and they would bring back specimens, and then he would decide whether or not they were new species.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
So, another thing that you've written about a bit is climate change. And of course, this all is part and parcel, the climate change and the effect on the 6th extinction and on species and ecosystems. So I just was thinking about climate change in general and how it lays on top of this, because it wasn't really mean, we knew about it, in the 70s and the 80s, but I don't think people thought it was going to be quite what it is now, that we're actually observing the impacts and the predictions that we're seeing right now. I just wonder what you think about as you look at the history of conservation, if you've thought at all about the history of like how climate change lays on that, and the dynamics of the science and the policy of climate change. Is that something you've dug into at all?
Yeah, very much so. And I mean, I had a lot of motivations for writing this book, but one of my motivations was a sense that there's an enormous interest, as well there should be, among younger generations in climate activism. But conservation it doesn't get as much attention from youth activists as climate change. And I mean, there are very understandable reasons for that. But I hoped to show that conservation is still incredibly important and so intertwined with climate. And I hope to show that sometimes I think there's a sense among young climate activists that the two things are in conflict, that conservation, in fact, especially can sometimes conflict with social justice, which it certainly has in the past. But I think there are ways in which it can promote social justice. And so I hope to show that there are ways that we can overcome that history and also serve climate stabilization, serve social justice, and serve conservation. I was really heartened by the IPBES report that came out in early June, pointing out that conservation and climate stabilization do have to work together, and emphasizing that there are some climate solutions that don't work particularly well for conservation, and that we should be careful to avoid those. We should be careful to choose solutions that promote them both, and that they're out there. Mm-hmm. So I think it's possible to do both, but I think it's also possible to work at cross purposes. So I think it's very important for us to choose our path carefully.
I couldn't agree more. So I wanted to ask you a sort of personal philosophical question, and that is, you have this great opportunity to sort of pick big projects to work on and to write about them, and you just described sort of some personal motivation for doing that. And I'm curious, sort of on the grand scheme, on the big arc, if you're putting the period on the last page of the last book that you'll ever write, which will be sometime long in the future, what will you hope that body of work will encompass, and like what will the legacy of that body of work be?
Well, that's good. It's good to think about. It's not something I think about every day, but I do think about it.
It would be paralyzing if you did.
It would be paralyzing to think about it every day. But when you writing books, I think does give you a sense that there is an object that will live on after you. So it does come to mind sometimes. I've always really loved the process that we were talking about earlier of translating complicated things into plain language. And I especially love translating complicated things, not to, as in one of my least favorite phrases, not to quote unquote dumb them down, but to introduce them to people who are extremely intelligent and curious, but just not specialists. So I like the idea, or I like that my goal, I think, is to communicate the complexity of some of these problems and some of these solutions that people like you are working on, but do it in a way that's digestible to someone who just doesn't think about these issues every day. They're thinking about other perhaps equally complicated issues, but they're not thinking about these particular issues. So I think my overall goal is to communicate complexity to a broad audience. I mean, conservation on so many levels is about protecting complexity, protecting the complexity of our ecosystems and our human societies. And if I can communicate the importance of that, then I'll have accomplished something I'm proud of.
That's fantastic, and you're absolutely right. Accounting is very complicated and hard to understand. And you need somebody to translate it for you, and the same is true with a lot of these different science topics. And it's not that people aren't smart enough to get it; it's just not their jargon and their experience. But having someone like you out there who is doing that translation is incredibly valuable, because we really do need everybody working on these problems of things like conservation and climate change, and people engaged and really understanding the science. Because in my view, you don't get to say, I believe in climate change. That's sort of like saying, I believe in gravity.
Right.
Physics and chemistry tell us that this is happening and that this is real. And you can debate how it's going to actually affect the world and what it's going to do to ecosystems and things like that. But the fact that it is happening is not something that's a question. And so having people understand that, because they can finally understand the science because of somebody who does a great job of explaining it like you out there, it's fantastic. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you. And I think that what you're doing is you are helping tell a more complex story about conservation by emphasizing the protection of ecosystems and showing how species fit into those ecosystems. Because I think for too long, conservation organizations have leaned on their flagship species and said, okay, well, give your $25 to protect the panda. And, while professional conservationists know very well that it's about much more than that. But I think there's sometimes a fear of, oh, well, we can't make it too complicated because we'll confuse people or alienate people, or people won't be as attached to, they won't be as attached to the hellbender as they are to the giant panda, and I love the hellbender, but I think, so part of the challenge is, unfortunately, though we might love to do so, we can't just open people's heads and pour information in. We have to think of ways that not only make sense, but that people will truly connect with on an emotional level. So I think part of my challenge as a writer and your challenge as a conservationist is finding the stories about ecosystems and about less, traditionally charismatic species that speak to people on some level, and help them not only understand the complexity, but really want to understand the complexity and want to protect that complexity.
Yeah. I appreciate you saying that. And in the sort of shameless self-promotion category, the Van Humboldt tour that is underway right now.
Yeah, Van Humboldt
has really been in a lot of ways about ecosystems. Spent several days on the trip in longleaf pine ecosystems, and it was less about the pine trees or the red-coated woodpeckers. It was about this ecosystem and how it used to have this huge extent, and now it's reduced. And in Tennessee, we went to the cedar glades, which is this very specific habitat type. And yes, there are endangered species on it, but it's because of the habitat and the ecosystem. And the same was true in West Virginia, where we went to an area that was about the habitat types that were being protected and less about the individual species. And it really, you're right, it's really, really important, because in the complexity of how all of this fits together, and then protecting the ecosystem so that the species are in their natural habitat. It's one of the great things that NatureServe, with the vegetation classification system that we have that's incorporated into some federal rulemaking and things. It's a great thing that we have access to here for conservation use.
Yeah, and it as you were talking about earlier, when we were talking about the sixth extinction, there are so many people's reasons for conservation are also complex. And I think, the information that you provide allows people to find those on their own. I mean, there's a long running debate in conservation biology about why do we protect species? Is it because they have intrinsic value, or is it because they have instrumental value? Or are we protecting nature for itself or for humans? And I always am confused and frustrated by that debate, because I think, well, both, right?
It's an and question.
And I mean, we're part, it's complex because we're part of what we're trying to protect. And so I think we can have many motivations. We can have, and we can have many motivations for protecting different species and different ecosystems, all of them quite valid, some of them self-interested, some of them not self-interested, and some more pressing than others. But we can, there are many ways for us to relate to and be concerned about these different places, and it's fine if they vary.
Yeah.
And if we have loyalties to one over the other, that's part of the complexity of conservation.
Multiple paths into it, whether you're Ducks Unlimited or Trout Unlimited, or you're with a more traditional conservation organization, if your interest is bird watching or anything. I think a lot of people who go out into nature to quote unquote hunt and fish are actually going out to meditate, and they just are afraid to say they're going out to meditate. So they bring a fishing pole with them. They may never actually cast a line, but
I would not be surprised. And I mean, friends of mine who have grown up hunting have talked about how, it was really, I'm not a hunter myself, but I have known plenty of people who do it and have done it growing up. And it really was about family time, or time in the woods. And you read about Aldo Leopold, who was perhaps one of the most famous hunter conservationists, and his dad, who had no scientific background, who just happened to have a strong ethical belief that people should limit the number of ducks they shot in a day. Mm-hmm. Sometimes made a point of going out in the woods without his gun and taking his kids along, just to show them that wasn't really the point,
right,
of what they were doing. Yeah,
well, that's wonderful. Well, on that note, I think we will wrap up today, although I think I could probably talk to you for the rest of the day, if you would tolerate me.
Yeah, likewise. It's fun to chat about what you're doing on the ground. It does remind me of Aldo Leopold did a game survey early in his career that at a time when people didn't know what was out there. And so he did much what you're doing, traveling around the Midwest, talking to people, asking them what they were seeing. And it was one of the first real records that we had of what was at risk. So, and what it gave people an idea of what needed to be done to protect habitat, which people hadn't been thinking about until the 1930s. So you're carrying on a fine tradition.
Well, with that compliment in mind, for me and for NatureServe and for our entire Natural Heritage Network, I want to thank you for that, and thank you for all that you do to get people inspired and to make a difference in the world. So thank you, Michelle Nijhuis, for all that you do and for being on Conservation Conversations.
Thanks so much, Sean, and safe travels.
Thanks.
Best wishes to von Humboldt.
Thank you.